Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today's story comes to us from the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia, sent in by a woman of 6'8" who asked to remain anonymous.
For the sake of this telling, I'll call her Barbara Moore. A couple of years ago, while quietly fighting a serious illness on her own, she became a victim inside her own son's house, abused by her daughter-in-law in ways that never left a single bruise on her skin. Exactly how it happened, I'll let you hear for yourselves. Every night before she turned off the lamp, Barbara Moore wound an old pocket watch. It had belonged to Richard, her husband gone now for 7 years. The silver case had dulled to the color of a rain cloud. The enamel face had yellowed like an old man's teeth, and there was a thin scratch running diagonally across the lid that she knew so well she could have found it blindfolded. She turned the crown exactly 12 times, no more, no less, because a mainspring that age does not forgive a careless hand. And then she held the watch to her ear. The ticking came up small and steady, a quick even heartbeat in the dark. 5 beats a second. She had counted them so many times over the years that she no longer had to count. Her body simply knew when one was missing. She didn't do this out of sentiment. Or rather, not only out of sentiment. She did it because for 40 years listening to machines like that one had been her living. And a person doesn't put down 40 years the way she puts down a cup. Barbara had been one of the very few certified horological appraisers in the entire Southeast. The woman people drove 3 hours to see when they had a watch and a question they couldn't answer. They came to her with inheritances and divorces and estate sales, with shoeboxes of their dead father's things, with objects they thought were treasure, and objects they were about to throw in the trash. They set them on the green felt pad on her workbench, and Barbara would screw the loop into her eye, ease open the case back with a tool ground especially thin, and look down into the movement, into the tiny brass forest of wheels and jewels and springs. And after a moment she would look up and tell them the truth. The truth was almost never what they expected. That was the first thing the work taught her. A watch could wear a face of solid gold, and hide a cheap stamped-out movement that wasn't worth the cost of repairing it all surface, all show. And a watch could come in looking like nothing at all, scratched and tarnished, and stopped dead for 30 years. And Barbara would open it and feel her pulse change, because down inside, where no one but a specialist would ever look, sat something rare and beautifully made, and quietly enormously valuable. You can't tell what a thing is worth by looking at the outside of it. She used to tell the apprentices back when the shop still took apprentices. You have to open it up and look at how it's built, what it's made of underneath, what it does when no one's watching it. She would tap the felt pad. People are the same, exactly the same. Richard used to say his wife had 2 different eyes, one for reading watches and one for reading people, and that neither of them was ever wrong. He said it as a joke. It was not entirely a joke, and they both knew it. They had met young, the two of them, in a cramped repair shop in Marietta, where Richard worked the bench with his sleeves rolled up and his fingers permanently faint with the smell of clock oil, a jeweler's loop screwed so habitually into his right eye that he developed a small permanent groove in the skin around it. He fixed them. She learned to value them. He was the surgeon. She was the one who could tell you whether the patient was a king or a pauper. Between the two of them, they could take any timepiece in the world apart on a Sunday afternoon and tell you both exactly what was broken and exactly what it would cost in money and in hours to make it whole again. They never got rich. People who fall in love with precision rarely do. The world does not pay well for patience. But they made a good life out of small, exact things. They made a son, Joshua. They made 35 years of marriage that were not perfect, but were honest, which Barbara had come to believe was the rarer and the better of the two. And for a long time, that felt like more than enough. It felt like plenty. Then Richard had a stroke at 61 on an ordinary Tuesday morning, standing at the kitchen counter with a half-buttered piece of toast in his hand. He was gone before the ambulance turned the corner at the end of their street. No warning. No long goodbye. One moment he was complaining mildly about the weather, and the next moment the toast was on the floor, and so was he. And the steady tick of the workshop clock on the wall kept going as if nothing at all had changed, which was the cruelest thing Barbara could remember about that morning, that the clock did not stop. Clocks never do. They keep their time through everything indifferent, and you are simply expected to keep yours alongside them. After the funeral, Barbara did what careful people do when the ground gives way. She made herself small and quiet and hard to read. She sold the house they'd shared because every room in it still had Richard's shape pressed into it, and she could not breathe. She moved into a one-bedroom apartment in Marietta with cheap rent and good east light. She drove a 14-year-old Honda the color of weak tea with 190,000 miles on it and a passenger door that stuck in the cold. She bought her clothes off the clearance rack and her coffee in a tin, and she lived as far as the entire world could tell on a teacher's modest pension, and the small, frugal routines of a widow who had long ago made her peace with having very little. That was what everyone believed. That was exactly what Barbara wanted everyone to believe. Because Barbara Moore had a secret, and the secret was this: when she sat down at her kitchen table at night and opened the banking application on her old laptop, the number that glowed up at her out of the dark was a little over $8 million. But I'm getting ahead of the story, and the story is worth more than the number. Barbara would be the first to tell you that. So let me slow down the way she would have the way she'd ease open a case back without forcing a single screw and start where the real trouble started, which was with a telephone call from her son on a cold evening in February. Joshua Moore was 38 when he called his mother and asked her to come and live with his family. He was a good man, Joshua, in the ordinary, insufficient way that good men so often are. He was an engineer who designed water treatment systems for small municipalities, a man comfortable with pipes and pressure, and the slow, forgiving logic of things that flow downhill. He was patient with machinery and patient with people sometimes to a fault, because somewhere along the way he had confused keeping the peace with being kind. He was the sort of man who could hold a room together simply by absorbing whatever was thrown into it. Every tension, every sharp word soaked up and quietly swallowed so that no one had to deal with it. He loved his mother. He loved her the way a man loves a thing he has never once imagined losing completely and without ever looking at it directly. "Mom," he said that night, and she could hear in the very first word that the call had been planned, discussed, agreed upon by two people before one of them dialed. "Hannah and I have been talking. We've got that extra room downstairs now that I've moved my home office up to the loft. And the kids, God, Dylan asks about you all the time. He wants to know why Grandma has to live so far away." A pause. Barbara had learned over a lifetime to listen into pauses the way she listened into a movement hunting past the loud, obvious wheels for the small, hidden one that was actually driving them all. And honestly, Joshua went on lower now, and this part at least was true. She could hear that it was true. "I worry about you out there on your own. You're not getting any younger. Neither am I. It would put my mind at ease, Mom, having you close. Knowing you're all right." Barbara held the phone against her ear and looked across the dim apartment at Richard's pocket watch on the nightstand ticking its small, steady tick. She knew precisely what the offer was, and she knew precisely what it was not. The part about the children was real, and the part about Joshua's worry was real, and she didn't doubt either one. Her grandson Dylan was 7 and ferociously, gloriously curious, a boy who wanted to know how everything worked and was personally offended when something wouldn't tell him. Her granddaughter Mia was 4 and ran the household like a small, sticky empress whose every decree had to be either obeyed or carefully negotiated. The thought of being near them every day was a warmth Barbara hadn't let herself feel in a long while. But she also knew with the cool clarity that had made her good at her work that her moving in would do something else, something no one would ever say out loud. It would provide free, loving, around-the-clock childcare. It would add $500 a month to the household. It would quietly relieve a great deal of pressure on a young couple who Barbara strongly suspected were carrying far more house than 2 salaries could comfortably hold. Because she knew about the house. Joshua and Hannah had bought a 4-bedroom new build in a manicured development out in East Cobb, the kind of place with a stone fountain at the entrance, and a name that tried very hard to sound like an old English estate and succeeded only in sounding like a perfume. Hannah had chosen it. Hannah chose most things. Hannah was a luxury real estate agent, and Barbara would always give her this: she was genuinely good at it. Sharp, polished relentlessly, and professionally pleasant, the kind of warm that switches on like a showroom light. She sold million-dollar homes to surgeons and tech executives and the newly divorced. And she was successful because she had absorbed all the way down to the bone the central faith of her trade that everything has a market value, that everything can be appraised, staged, listed, and moved, that the worth of a thing is exactly precisely what someone will pay for it on a given day, not $1 more and not $1 less, and certainly nothing so foolish and unsellable as sentiment. Barbara had recognized something in her the very first time they met years before the wedding, the way a person who works with crystal learns to spot a hairline crack long before it becomes a break. It wasn't damage yet. It was only the faint particular place where damage would someday under enough pressure begin. Hannah had been perfectly even effusively warm to her. And in the middle of all that warmth over dessert, she had asked Barbara lightly, sweetly, eyes bright, what her little watch business was actually worth these days market-wise. Twice. The first time Richard laughed it off. The second time he laughed it off again and squeezed Barbara's knee under the table. Barbara had said nothing and smiled and filed it away. She filed a great many things away. Filing things away was in a sense her entire profession. "All right," she told Joshua that night on the phone. "I'll come, on one condition." "Mom, come on, you don't have to put conditions." "I'll pay a household contribution, every month, $500. "That's ridiculous. You're my mother, you're not a—" "It is not ridiculous. It's right," Barbara said in the level, final voice that had ended 40 years of negotiations over what an estate was worth. "I will not move into someone's home and become a burden. Either I contribute or I stay where I am. Those are the terms, and they're not negotiable." He protested the way decent people protest when they have already privately decided to accept. She held firm. He gave in. And that, Barbara would reflect much later, was the entire shape of her son captured in a single phone call he meant well, and when it came to it, he gave in. It was the best and the most dangerous thing about him, and she had loved him for the first part without ever quite forgiving the second. What neither of them said aloud, what hummed underneath the whole conversation like the lowest, slowest gear in a complicated movement, was that $500 a month from a poor old widow would help, that it would matter, that somewhere in that big house with the perfume name someone had already opened a spreadsheet and was quietly, expertly doing the math. For the first stretch, it was good. Barbara would never deny that, not even at the worst of what came later. Honesty was a discipline with her the same as winding the watch. She took over the school run for Dylan and the long, sticky afternoons with Mia. She sat up through ear infections and bad dreams and one memorable bout of stomach flu that moved through the house like a small biblical plague. She learned the exact temperature Mia required her milk and the exact order in which Dylan needed his bedtime routine performed, or the entire evening would collapse. And she discovered to a delight that caught her off guard that Dylan had inherited some restless, prying mechanical hunger that she recognized from the inside because it was hers. She gave him a broken wind-up alarm clock she found at a yard sale, and a small screwdriver and an old towel to lay the pieces on so none would roll away, and she taught him the names of things in a low voice while Mia slept down the hall. Mainspring, that's where the power's stored. Balance wheel, that's the heartbeat. See how it swings escapement. That's the clever one. That's the part that decides how fast the power's allowed to come out so it doesn't all rush at once and burn through. Dylan repeated the words back like incantations, his small face fierce with concentration, and Barbara felt for the first time since Richard died that some part of her was being handed forward into the world instead of simply running down. She gave Joshua the $500 in a plain envelope on the first of every month without ceremony, and every single time he thanked her with a warmth that was real, and that she chose to keep believing was real even later when believing it cost her something. And then the way these things always do it began to shift. Never all at once. It is never all at once. That is what makes it so hard to name and so hard to fight. It came in the slow accumulation of small indignities, each one on its own, too minor to mention, without sounding petty paranoid like a difficult old woman keeping score. Hannah started calling the downstairs bedroom the office again. "Honey, I left the good printer paper in the office. Can you grab a ream?" while Barbara was in fact still very much sleeping in it, her nightgown on the hook behind the door. Richard's watch ticking on the borrowed nightstand. The word landed each time like a thumbtack pressed into skin too small to bleed. Hannah began booking client showings and broker dinners on weeknights without mentioning them in advance, so that Barbara would discover at 5 in the afternoon, by way of a breezy text, that she was by default, by assumption without anyone ever quite asking, expected to feed 2 children, bathe them, hear their prayers, and put them to bed alone. It was never framed as a request. It was framed as a fact of the weather. Stuck at a showing back late, you're a lifesaver, XX. And when Hannah's friends came over glossy, laughing women with good handbags and whitened teeth, she did not introduce Barbara by name. Barbara would come up from the basement or in from the school run with Mia on her hip, and Hannah would gesture in her general direction with a vague, graceful flick of the wrist and say, "Oh, that's Joshua's mom. She's staying with us for a bit," in a tone that placed Barbara somewhere on the household inventory between the cleaning lady and the houseplants. Staying with us for a bit. Barbara had been there 14 months at that point. She had been raising the woman's children 3 afternoons a week for over a year. For a bit. Barbara said nothing. She watched. 40 years of looking into the backs of watches, and before that, a whole childhood of being the quiet one in a loud family, had taught her that you learn the most about any mechanism precisely when it does not know it is being observed. A watchmaker doesn't trust what a movement does when you're staring at it and tapping the case. She trusts what it does when it thinks it's alone running in the dark, under no scrutiny at all. That's where the real faults show. That's where the true quality or the true cheapness reveals itself. So Barbara observed. She wound Richard's watch its 12 careful turns every night, and she held it to her ear, and she listened to the watch, and to the house, and to the woman moving through it. And she kept waiting with a patience that was either wisdom or heartbreak, and was probably, as her old attorney had once told her, both. She kept waiting to be proven wrong about that hairline crack in the crystal. She was not proven wrong. She was very slowly and very thoroughly proven right. It was a little over a year before the diagnosis when Hannah came to her with the spreadsheet. She did it beautifully. Barbara had to give her that, and did even in the letter years later. There was a real artistry to it. Hannah made tea, the good loose-leaf kind she normally kept for clients. She waited until Joshua was upstairs and the children were in bed. She sat down across from Barbara at the wide marble kitchen island with her laptop and her flawless manicure, and she pitched her voice down into something soft and confiding and intimate, woman to woman, daughter to mother. "Barbara, I want to run something by you. And I need you to please just hear me all the way out before you say anything. Okay?" There was a property, Hannah explained. A tired, dated, perfectly located house 2 streets over an estate sale. The owner recently passed the heirs, scattered across 3 states and desperate to be rid of it, priced to move. Hannah knew that street the way Barbara knew the inside of a movement. She'd personally sold 3 houses on it in 2 years and could recite the comps in her sleep. If they could buy it cheap and pour 80-some thousand into a fast surgical renovation, and Hannah had the contractors on speed dial. Hannah had the eye. Hannah did this for a living. They could turn it around inside 6 months and clear $150,000 in profit. Easily, maybe more if the market held. "It is not a risk," she said, turning the laptop so the glow of the spreadsheet fell across Barbara's face, the columns lined up neat and confident as soldiers on parade. "I want to be so clear about that. This is the surest thing I have ever seen in 12 years in this business. The only thing standing between us and that profit is liquidity. We're stretched thin right now. The mortgage, the cars, Dylan's school, and the banks are being absolutely impossible about a second loan. We don't need much. We just need a bridge. $87,000. 6 months tops and you'd have it back." She let that number settle in the warm kitchen air. Then she delivered the part she had clearly rehearsed, lowering her lashes, letting a small expert catch enter her voice. "And Barbara, I want you to know I would never ever ask. It kills me to ask. But your family. And I thought maybe you'd want to be part of building something. For Dylan. For Mia. This would all go toward their future. Their college someday. I just thought you'd want to be a part of that instead of Paul." The smallest pause, the smallest blade, instead of just watching from the sidelines. Barbara let the silence stretch out long and comfortable. She was very, very good at silence. She had spent 4 decades letting anxious people fill the quiet with their hopes and their lies, while she turned their treasure slowly under the light and decided what it really was. "That," she said at last, "is a great deal of money, Hannah." I know it is. I do. I'm not sure I have anything like that just sitting around. I live on a pension, dear. I gave you $500 in an envelope this morning." And there it was. It crossed Hannah's lovely face for less than a heartbeat, quick as the sweep of a sweep-second hand gone, almost before it arrived. But Barbara had spent her entire life training her eye to catch exactly the things that vanished that fast. It was a flicker of recalculation, of revaluation. The precise involuntary expression of an appraiser who has just lifted the loop, looked into the movement, and discovered that the piece on the felt is worth considerably less than the asking price suggested. Barbara watched her daughter-in-law adjust the estimate of her downward live in real time, watched the figure for Barbara Moore drop on some internal spreadsheet behind those bright eyes. And underneath that recalculation, riding just beneath it like the faint scrape of a worn pivot, was the beginning of something colder. Contempt. The particular contempt of a person who believes all the way down where her real convictions live that someone without money is in some basic and permanent sense a person without weight. A person who can be moved like furniture, staged, relisted, or simply taken off the market when she stops appreciating in value. Barbara saw every bit of it. She had spent her whole life identifying fakes, and she knew exactly what she was looking at across that beautiful marble island. "I might," she said slowly, and watched the flicker reverse itself, watched the warmth come flooding back into Hannah's face like water finding its level. "Be able to find some of it, if it's done properly, if it's a real loan on real paper." Of course, Barbara, whatever you need, however you want to. I mean a real agreement, drawn up by my own attorney, signed, notarized, everything in writing." Barbara folded her hands on the cool stone. "I'm an old woman, and I don't do money on a handshake. Not even with family. Especially not with family that's how families come apart doing money on a handshake. My husband taught me that. Hope for the best, he always said. Document everything." "Absolutely. No, that's honestly Barbara, that's so smart, that's the responsible thing. We'll sign whatever you put in front of us." And so they did. Now here is the part that no one in that house understood at the time. Here is the first thing Barbara Moore quietly did that I want you to sit up and pay attention to, because it tells you exactly who she was underneath the cardigan and the weak tea-colored car. She called her attorney a precise, unhurried woman named Eleanor, who had handled Barbara's affairs for over a decade, and was one of perhaps 3 people alive who knew the truth about her finances, and she had a loan agreement drawn up. A real one. Not a favor dressed up as a formality. A genuine instrument. $87,000 at 5% interest compounded annually with a clear repayment schedule. And recorded properly with the county the way a real lien is recorded, the way that surfaces the instant anyone runs a title search on the property, a lien against the very house that Joshua and Hannah lived in. Their home pledged as collateral in black and white, filed and stamped and legally binding, and folded quietly into the 5th paragraph in clean language that Hannah's eyes slid straight over because she was already spending the profit in her head. An acceleration clause, a provision stating that upon the occurrence of certain conditions or simply at the lender's sole and absolute discretion, the entire outstanding balance, plus all accrued interest, could be declared immediately due and payable in full within 60 days. When Barbara slid the documents across the marble island a week later, she made it small. She made it nothing. She smiled the gentle, slightly fluttery smile of a harmless old woman, and she said, "Oh, don't mind all the legal language, it's just how Eleanor does things. She insists. I'd never in 100 years actually hold you to the fine print, you both know that. It's only so the paperwork's clean and tidy." Hannah signed without reading past the first page. Of course she did. She was thinking about marble countertops and staging furniture and $150,000 in profit. Joshua signed because Hannah slid the pen across to him, and because he was a man who gave in with the faintly embarrassed half-smile of a grown son borrowing money from his mother. Neither of them, not for 1 second, was thinking about the quiet woman in the gray cardigan sitting across from them, watching them ink their names onto a document she had designed with exactly the same patience she had once used to rebuild a movement that had been dropped on a concrete floor spring by tiny spring until it kept perfect time again. I want to be very clear about something here, because Barbara herself was very clear about it in her letter and underlined it twice. She did not set a trap. She would have said that to your face and held your eye while she said it. She had not moved into that house to ensnare anyone. She had moved in because Joshua was her son, because Dylan and Mia were her grandchildren, and because she was in the simplest and loneliest sense of the word alone in the world with a ticking watch in an empty apartment. But she had also lived 66 years by then. She had spent 40 of them learning in the most literal way a person can learn it the exact and unbridgeable difference between what a thing appears to be worth and what it is actually worth underneath. And she had never once in all that time been able to stop herself from quietly, methodically protecting the things she loved against the day that someone might try to tell her they were worthless. She did not yet know that the day was coming. She knew only this as she walked back down the hall to the room that was still whatever anyone chose to call it her bedroom, as she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and picked up Richard's watch, and gave the crown its 12 slow, careful turns. The hairline crack in the crystal that she had been watching for 14 patient months had finally faintly begun to spread. And Barbara Moore, who had spent her whole life listening to the small sounds that tell you something is about to break, set the watch against her ear in the dark and listened and waited. The mass was found as these things so often are by accident. Barbara had gone in for a routine mammogram in late October, the kind of appointment she kept the way she kept all her appointments early and without fuss. A week later, the clinic called her back for additional imaging, then a biopsy, then a phone call on a gray Thursday afternoon from a calm and careful physician named Dr. Priya Mehta, who did not waste Barbara's time with euphemism which Barbara appreciated more than she could say. "It's cancer, Mrs. Moore, breast. But I want the very first thing you hear from me to be this: we caught it early. Stage 1. Small, contained no sign it spread. The prognosis for this, caught at this stage in someone in your general health, is excellent." Barbara sat very still at her kitchen table with the phone against her ear and the afternoon light lying flat and gold across the marble, and she did what she had trained herself over a lifetime to do. She listened past the loud word cancer for the small, quiet wheels turning underneath it. Early. Stage 1. Contained. Excellent. "Tell me the plan," she said. "All of it. In order." Dr. Mehta told her. Surgery first, a lumpectomy removing the mass and a clean margin around it, very likely an outpatient procedure or a single overnight. Then radiation, several weeks of it, short daily sessions. Then almost certainly a hormone-blocking pill taken once a day for years afterward, the kind of small ongoing maintenance that doesn't cure so much as it quietly keeps the door shut. No chemotherapy, no hair loss, no long descent. With treatment, Dr. Mehta said again because she could hear that Barbara was a woman who needed the truth, said twice before she'd trust it the long-term outlook was very good. Barbara thanked her, hung up, set the phone face down on the marble, and sat for a while in the gold light. She was not afraid exactly. She had buried a husband. She knew the real shape of the worst thing, and this was not it. What she felt instead was something closer to the calm she felt when a difficult piece came across her bench, a complicated repair, but a known one with a clear sequence and a clear end. Open it. Find the fault. Fix it in order. Close it back up. She would do the surgery and the radiation and the daily pill, and she would in all probability be fine. She told them at dinner that Thursday night. She kept her voice level and her hands quiet, and she laid it out the way Dr. Mehta had laid it out for her, the staging, the plan, the timeline, the good prognosis. She told them it was caught early. She told them she was going to be all right. Joshua's face came apart. He reached across the table and took her hand, and his eyes filled at once the way they had at Richard's funeral, that raw and helpless grief that men carry folded up small and almost never let anyone see. "Mom," he said, and then nothing else, because there was nothing else in him that could get out. Hannah said, "Oh, Barbara, that must have been so frightening to hear." She said it well. She said it with her head tilted and her hand pressed lightly to her own collarbone. But Barbara, who had spent 40 years telling the genuine article from the convincing fake, who knew in her fingertips the difference between a feeling and the performance of a feeling, heard the thing underneath it. Hannah was not feeling for Barbara. Hannah was constructing an appropriate response to be seen feeling. The words were correct in every particular and hollow all the way through like a gold case wrapped around a stamped tin movement. Barbara thanked them both, and they finished dinner, and the children were put to bed, and she did not let her face show that she had heard the hollowness. She had grown very practiced at not letting her face show things. Now I have to stop the story for a moment the way Barbara stopped it in her letter and tell you where the $8 million came from. Because it matters. It matters more than the number itself, and it tells you everything about the woman this happened to. It did not come from land or luck or a lawsuit or a lottery. It came in the beginning from a watch. Almost 30 years before any of this, when Joshua was still a boy and the repair shop was barely paying its own rent, a man had come in one afternoon to settle a debt he owed Richard for months of repair work he couldn't pay cash for. By way of settling it, he'd handed over a tarnished, stopped, unremarkable-looking wristwatch he'd inherited from an uncle and clearly considered worthless. Richard had taken it to clear the books more out of kindness than anything and set it aside. Barbara opened it that night at the kitchen table the way she opened everything, expecting nothing. She did not get nothing. She got the particular lurch in the chest that comes perhaps a handful of times in a career, the feeling of looking into a movement and realizing that the scratched, ignored, written-off thing in your hands is rare, genuinely, seriously rare. A specific reference from a specific maker in a specific small production run the kind of piece that collectors 3 continents away quietly hunt for their whole lives. She didn't tell the man because the man no longer owned it. The debt was settled, the watch was theirs fair and square and on the books. She simply cleaned it, brought it back to life. And a year later, when a dealer she trusted put the right buyer in front of her, she sold it. It was the most money the two of them had ever held at once. And here is the fork in the road, the place where most people would have gone one way and Barbara went the other. They could have spent it. A nicer house, a newer car, a real vacation, the first in their married life. Richard, God love him, half wanted to. Barbara didn't. Barbara took nearly all of it and quietly, patiently, the way she did everything she put it to work. She bought into a few unglamorous, well-run companies she'd researched until she understood them, the kind of boring, durable businesses that simply keep doing what they do. And then she did the single most powerful and least dramatic thing a person can do with money. She left it alone. She reinvested every dividend. She didn't touch the principal. She didn't brag, didn't check it obsessively, didn't move it around, chasing the next clever thing. She let compounding, that slow, patient, almost invisible engine, the financial cousin of the escapement she'd spent her life admiring, the mechanism that releases power gradually so it doesn't all burn off at once. She let it run for 30 years in the dark untouched while she drove her weak tea Honda and bought her clothes on sale. When Richard died, she folded his small life insurance in and let that run too. And by the autumn that the mammogram came back wrong, the boring little seed from one overlooked watch had quietly become a forest worth a little over $8 million. She had told almost no one. Not Joshua, not her church, not her friends. Only her attorney Eleanor, her investment advisor, and her younger sister Carol down in Savannah, who had nearly fallen off her chair when she finally found out. Eleanor had asked her once years earlier why. Why live so small, so deliberately invisible, sitting on so much? And Barbara had said the truest thing she knew about herself. Because I spent my whole life learning to tell what people are really worth on the inside, she said. And the only way to ever truly know that about the people around you is to let them believe you have nothing to offer them. Then you get to see who they actually are. She had paused. I want to know who my family is when they think there's nothing in it for them. Eleanor had looked at her for a long moment over her glasses and said, Barbara, that's either the wisest thing I've ever heard a client say, or it's going to break your heart. Barbara had told her probably both. She was about to find out exactly how right Eleanor had been. The surgery was scheduled for the second week of November. It went smoothly. Dr. Mehta was pleased the margins were clean, the early staging held. But Barbara was 66, and her surgeon wanted her watched closely for the first stretch of recovery, rather than sent home to an empty downstairs bedroom in a busy house. So she was moved for 10 days or so into a small private room in a recovery and rehabilitation facility a few miles from Joshua's house. A quiet place, well regarded, with monitored rooms and nurses on call. And here is a detail that matters a great deal, so let me set it down plainly. The day before Barbara was moved there, Joshua, who worried who couldn't be there during work hours, who wanted his mind put at ease the way he'd said on the phone all those months ago, bought a small Wi-Fi camera, the kind people use to check on a sleeping baby or an aging parent. He drove over on his lunch break and set it up himself high in the corner of her room, angled down over the bed where it could quietly send video to an app on his phone so he could look in on his mother whenever the worry got to be too much. He did it out of love. I want that to be completely clear. And then he did one ordinary, fateful human thing in the rush of a workday. He forgot to mention it to his wife. He never told Hannah the camera was there. There was no reason it would come up. It sat in the corner, small and dark, and easy to miss, doing exactly what he'd set it to do. And Hannah, walking into that room over the following days, had absolutely no idea that anything was watching her at all. She thought she was alone with a weak old woman who had nothing left to offer her. The first days after surgery were a fog. Between the anesthetic still working its way out and the pain medication keeping the worst of the soreness at bay, Barbara drifted. She slept oddly and woke confused, the room swimming the light wrong. Time came loose. And in that fog, she began to have the sense, vague, slippery, impossible to pin down, that something was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with the surgery. That at certain hours, when Hannah came to sit with her, the air in the room changed. That things were said. That her water was somehow always just out of reach. The call button somehow always slipped to the far side of the tray table. Her glasses somehow always moved, but she couldn't hold on to it. Every time she surfaced clear enough to think something is wrong here, the medication would pull her back under, and when she came up again, she would wonder if she'd dreamed it, if it was the drugs, if a frightened, foggy old woman recovering from cancer surgery was simply imagining cruelty where there was only fatigue. She began in those days to doubt her own mind, and there are few things in this world more frightening than the moment a sharp woman starts to wonder whether she can still trust what she sees. What was happening was not a dream. When Hannah was alone in that room, when she believed she was alone with no witness but a sedated patient who'd never be sure of anything, she let the warm showroom light switch off completely, and something flat and cold came up behind it. She did not hit her. She never laid a hand on her, and she would cling to that fact later as though it were innocence. What she did was worse in the ways that matter and easier to deny in the ways that count. She leaned over the bed and told Barbara in a low, pleasant voice that no one was coming, that Joshua was sick of the burden of her, that the family had already talked and decided she'd be going into a home after this and wouldn't be coming back to the house. She moved the water out of reach and watched her strain for it. She slid the call button off the tray and let her fumble. She told a woman recovering from cancer surgery that she was a leech, a dead weight, a guest who'd badly overstayed, that her own son discussed her like a bill that wouldn't stop coming. She said it quietly, smiling faintly in the bright tone you'd use to read a child a story, so that even if Barbara repeated a single word of it, it would sound insane. She was so kind to me. She sat with me every day. Ask the nurses. It was abuse engineered specifically to leave no bruise, to be invisible, to be unprovable, to live entirely in the space between a confused patient's word and a polished daughter-in-law's smile. It was God help her almost perfect. She had only made one mistake. She didn't know about the small, dark camera in the corner sending every minute of it quietly to her husband's phone. It was a nurse who broke it open. A nurse named Gloria who had worked that floor for 19 years and had developed over those 19 years an instinct that no training program can teach, a sense for the particular flavor of a room where something is wrong. Gloria had noticed things. A patient who flinched very slightly when a certain visitor came in. Water glasses found pushed to the far edge of trays. A bright, attentive daughter-in-law whose brightness clicked off the instant she thought the doorway was empty. One afternoon, Gloria came in quietly to check a line and caught the tail end of it, caught Hannah leaning over the bed mid-sentence, caught the look on her face before the warm mask snapped back into place, caught the way Barbara shrank into the pillow. It was a fragment. It would never have been enough on its own. But Gloria had seen enough rooms in 19 years to know what she was looking at, and she did not let it go. She didn't confront Hannah. She was too experienced for that. She went instead to the one person she judged would actually do something with it. She called Joshua on his own and away from the facility, and she chose her words with great care. And she told him gently and plainly that she had concerns about how his mother was being treated by the woman who visited her, and that he might, she put it as carefully as she could, he might want to find a way to see for himself. Joshua stood in a hospital parking lot with the phone against his ear and the bottom dropping out of his stomach, and he remembered the camera. He'd half forgotten it. He'd set it up out of worry, glanced at the app a couple of times, seen his mother sleeping, felt reassured, stopped checking. Now he sat in his car with his thumb hovering over the icon and Gloria's careful voice in his ears and a cold certainty he didn't want spreading through his chest, and he opened it and he scrolled back. He watched it alone in his car in the dark of the parking lot, and then he went home and did the thing he would spend the rest of his life being unable to forget. He watched it again from the beginning, all of it, the whole saved record of the days his mother had spent in that room. I am not going to make you sit through what he saw the way he had to. Barbara, in her letter, didn't describe it in detail either, and I think that was mercy toward herself and toward us. But she told me what it did to her son. She told me that Joshua called his Aunt Carol that night, her sister, not his own wife, and that at 11 o'clock he still could not finish a sentence. That this patient, peacekeeping, conflict-swallowing man who had spent his whole life absorbing things so he wouldn't have to face them, sat in his car outside his own house, the house with the lien on it he didn't understand yet, the house with his wife asleep inside it, and could not make himself go in, because it wasn't one bad moment. That was the thing that broke him. If it had been one moment, one snapped sentence from an exhausted woman, he might have found a way to fold it up and swallow it like he swallowed everything. But the camera had recorded days. He scrolled back, and it was there on Tuesday, and it was there on Wednesday, and it was there again on Thursday. The water moved out of reach. The call button slid away. The low, pleasant poison poured into his mother's ear, hour after hour, while she lay there sedated and shrinking and trying to decide whether she was imagining it. It was a pattern. It was a practice. It was something his wife had done and returned to do and done again, with the patient repeated care of a habit. And it had been aimed at a woman they all believed had nothing. That was the part that would not leave him. Hannah had looked at his mother, frail, poor, recovering from cancer, worth in Hannah's eyes approximately the $500 she handed over in an envelope every month, and decided that a person of so little value could be treated like this safely, like furniture you no longer wanted, like a listing you'd simply taken off the market. He didn't know yet about the $8 million. He didn't know about the lien or the acceleration clause, or the boring forest that one overlooked watch had quietly grown into over 30 years. He only knew sitting in that dark car that the most capable and careful person he had ever known had been treated as worthless under his own roof by the person he had married, and that he had been so busy keeping the peace that he hadn't seen a thing. But Hannah had made a second mistake, and this one Joshua found only because he kept watching, because once he started, he couldn't stop, and he scrolled forward past the cruelty into something he understood even less. On the footage from the last 2 days, when the worst of Barbara's fog was at its thickest, the camera caught Hannah doing something other than tormenting her. It caught her bringing documents to the bed. Barbara, in her letter, said she had almost no memory of it, a vague underwater impression of Hannah's voice, soft and coaxing now, of a pen pressed into her loose fingers, of being told just sign here, it's only paperwork, it's for your own protection, just here and here. On the video, it was unmistakable. Hannah sitting on the edge of the bed of a heavily medicated cancer patient, guiding her hand across a signature line. Twice. 3 times. When Joshua finally brought himself to find out what the documents were, and it took Eleanor Barber's attorney 2 days to untangle it, the shape of it came clear, and it was uglier than the cruelty, because the cruelty might have been called cracking under pressure, and this could not be called anything but a plan. Hannah had been trying to get herself made power of attorney over Barber's affairs. She'd had papers drawn up financial power of attorney control over Barber's accounts and decisions, and she'd waited until the old woman was sedated and confused, and then sat on the edge of the bed and walked her hand through, signing them sweetly, patiently, just here and here. She thought she was looting a dying woman's pension. She thought she was getting her hands on the modest leavings of a poor old widow before they got swallowed up by a nursing home. A few $1,000s a sad little estate hardly worth the effort, except that Hannah was a person who could not look at any asset, however small, without wanting to manage it, list it, move it. She had no idea, not the faintest, wildest idea, that the frail, foggy, worthless old woman, whose hand she was guiding across that signature line, was worth a little over $8 million. And she had no idea that every second of her doing it had been recorded in clear and patient detail by a small, dark camera in the corner of the room that her son Joshua had placed there out of love and forgotten to mention to his wife. They told Barbara everything on the day she was discharged. Not at the facility Joshua wanted her home first, or at least somewhere that wasn't that room. He brought her not to his house, but to her sister Carol's, who had driven up from Savannah the moment she'd heard Joshua's voice on the phone that night, and had not left since. They sat Barbara down in Carol's sunroom with a cup of tea she didn't drink, and Joshua, who had not slept in 3 days, and set his phone on the table between them, and told his mother what was on it. He made himself say all of it. The water moved out of reach. The call button. The things Hannah had said, the cruelty poured patiently into her ear day after day while she lay there doubting her own mind. And then the documents, the power of attorney, the pen guided across the signature line. Barbara listened without moving. She had thought in the fog that she might have imagined the worst of it. To learn that she had not, that it had all been real, every cold word of it, and worse, that it had been recorded that her son had watched it, was its own particular kind of blow. But Barbara Moore had spent her whole life looking at hard truths through a loop without flinching, and she did not flinch now. She sat very still, and her face did the thing it had learned to do over 66 years, which was to show nothing at all. When Joshua finished, the only sound in the sunroom was Carol's old wall clock ticking. "Mom," Joshua said, and his voice broke on the single syllable. "Mom, I am so sorry. I should have seen it. I put you in that house. I let her—" He stopped. "I don't know how to make this right. I don't think I can." Barbara looked at her son for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and laid her hand over his the way she had when he was small and had broken something and was waiting to be punished. "You did one thing right," she said quietly. "You put the camera there, and you looked." She pressed his hand. "Most people don't look, Joshua. Most people spend their whole lives not looking because looking costs too much. You looked. We'll start from that." Then she let go of his hand and she straightened in her chair, and something in the room changed. Carol said afterward that she actually felt it change the way the air changes before weather. The frail, recovering patient receded, and in her place sat the woman who had spent 40 years telling people without sentiment and without mercy exactly what the thing in their hands was really worth. "Now," Barbara said, "I need you to call Eleanor, and I need you to listen carefully because there are some things about your mother that you don't know, and it's time you did." She did not tell him about the $8 million all at once. She was too careful for that. And besides, she had learned long ago that the truth lands harder when it's revealed in the right order. She told Eleanor instead, called her that same afternoon from Carol's sunroom, and what she said to her attorney was brief and level and unmistakable. "Eleanor, I need to see you tomorrow. Bring the loan agreement. I'm buying a house and I'm invoking the acceleration clause." A pause. "It's time." Eleanor, who had been waiting for some version of this call for over a decade, who had warned Barbara that this exact day might come and might break her heart, did not waste a word. "I'll have everything ready," she said. "Are you all right, Barbara?" "No," Barbara said. "But I will be. Hope for the best. Document everything." She hung up, and then she went back to a thing she had in fact already quietly started weeks before the surgery in the early days when the small indignities had begun to pile up, and some careful instinct had whispered to her that she might want a door of her own to walk through. She opened her laptop and she pulled up the listings she'd been bookmarking, the ones she'd told herself she was only looking at out of idle curiosity, the way you keep a fire exit in the corner of your eye without admitting you expect a fire. There were 4. By the next morning she'd narrowed it to 1. It was a brick craftsman bungalow in a quiet old tree-lined neighborhood, not far from Carroll. 3 bedrooms, a sunroom that faced the morning heart pine floors that glowed like honey in the afternoon, and in the back, a small workshop that the previous owner had used for woodworking, and that Barbara saw the instant she walked into it as something else entirely, a place for a bench and a loop and a green felt pad, and the slow good work of bringing stopped things back to life. The owners had already moved out of state. They wanted a fast, clean sale, full asking price. Barbara told the agent, a brisk, no-nonsense woman who clearly hadn't expected those words from a soft-spoken woman in a cardigan who'd arrived in a 14-year-old Honda. "Cash. No financing contingency. How quickly can we close?" The agent didn't quite manage to hide her surprise. "If they're motivated, and they are, we could close in 10 days, 2 weeks at the outside." "They're motivated," Barbara said. "So am I." She signed the purchase agreement the following afternoon in Eleanor's office, and Eleanor slid the folder across the desk with the quiet, almost giddy satisfaction of a woman who had kept an enormous secret faithfully for over a decade and was finally permitted to set it down. "You're certain about the acceleration clause?" Eleanor said. It wasn't really a question. "They signed the agreement," Barbara answered. "They pledged the house. They owe what they owe with interest. That's a little over $91,000 now." She folded her hands. "Yes, I'm certain. It will come as a shock to them." "Most consequences do," Barbara said. "That's rather the point of them." She moved out of Joshua and Hannah's house on a Tuesday, 12 days after she'd been discharged, while Hannah was out at a showing and the children were at school. She did it quietly with a small moving company and 2 patient men who carried her few boxes without comment. She took the things that were hers, her clothes, her photographs of Richard, the small tool chest of her trade, and last from the nightstand in the room that had never stopped being the office his pocket watch. She left almost nothing behind. On the kitchen island, the same marble island where Hannah had once turned a laptop toward her and asked for $87,000, she set a single sealed envelope. Inside it was that month's $500 contribution in cash, the way she'd always handed it over, and a short note in her small, precise hand. "Thank you for the time in your home. I found a place of my own. I wish your family well." That was all. No accusation. No reference to the room, the camera, the documents, the $8 million sitting in accounts Hannah didn't know existed. Nothing Hannah could use, nothing Hannah could spin, nothing that gave anything away. Just a sick old woman apparently quietly removing her small, worthless self from a house that had made it clear it was done with her. Hannah, when she got home and found the envelope, felt Barbara learned this later and allowed herself to enjoy it more than was strictly Christian relieved. Relieved. She thought she'd won. She thought the problem had solved itself, that the burden had finally taken the hint and removed itself, and that the inconvenient business with the power of attorney documents could be quietly tidied up at leisure now that the old woman was gone. She actually told a friend that week that things were so much calmer with Joshua's mother finally out of the house. She had no idea that the calm was the held breath before the strike. She had no idea that Eleanor was already drafting the letter. She had no idea, in fact, of anything that mattered, because she had spent 14 months looking at Barbara Moore and seeing nothing, and a person who sees nothing is a person who never sees it coming. Eleanor made the call on a Wednesday afternoon at 2 o'clock. She told Barbara about it afterward in her usual way, chronologically precisely without flourish, and Barbara in her letter set it down almost word for word, because she had thought about this moment for so long, that hearing it described was like watching a movement she'd designed finally tick to life. Eleanor identified herself. She said she represented Barbara Moore in her financial and estate affairs and asked whether Joshua and Hannah could come to her office on a matter that concerned them both. Joshua, of course, already knew he'd been part of it for days. But Hannah did not, and it was important Barbara had insisted that Hannah come into that room knowing nothing, the way Barbara had spent 14 months in that house, knowing things and saying nothing. They arrived together at 3:15, Joshua quiet and pale. Hannah composed, faintly irritated, certain this was some tedious bit of estate housekeeping about a poor old woman's affairs. Perhaps she may have thought even good news, some small bequest, some tidying of accounts in her favor. Eleanor did not rush. She laid the documents on the desk in a particular order, the order Barbara had chosen, because Barbara understood better than anyone alive that the sequence of a revelation is the whole art of it. First, she laid down a single sheet, a statement from Barbara's investment account. Current balance. Barbara had told Eleanor exactly where to let the silence fall, and Eleanor let it fall there while Hannah's eyes traveled across the page, found the number, and stopped. $8,240,000. Eleanor said nothing. She simply let Hannah look at it. She let her look at it for a long time. This is... Hannah started, and her voice did something it was not used to doing. It wavered. Whose is this? This is Barbara's. This is your mother-in-law's, yes, Eleanor said. She's a careful investor, has been for 30 years. She gives us $500 a month, Hannah said, and the words came out strange and high. She sleeps in our she drives that car. That was her choice, Eleanor said pleasantly. The contributions were entirely voluntary. She's a private person. Then Eleanor laid down the second document. The deed to a brick craftsman bungalow purchased 11 days earlier for cash. And Barbara watched through Eleanor's careful retelling as her daughter-in-law began to understand that the burden had not crept off in defeat, that the burden had bought a house outright in cash while Hannah was congratulating herself on getting rid of her. And then Eleanor laid down the third document, and it was the loan agreement, $87,000 signed and notarized with 2 signatures on it, Joshua's and Hannah's own, and the lien recorded against the very roof over their heads, and the acceleration clause that Hannah's eyes had slid across a year ago without ever once reading. Your mother-in-law, Eleanor said, is invoking the acceleration clause per Section 5 of this agreement. The full outstanding balance with accrued interest is $91,462. It is now due and payable in full, within 60 days. The silence in that office, Eleanor told Barbara, lasted nearly a full minute. Hannah, the woman who knew the price of everything, who could appraise a house at a glance and value a stranger across a dinner table who had looked at Barbara Moore and assessed her at exactly the $500 she handed over each month, sat very still and discovered that the single most important appraisal of her life had been catastrophically, ruinously wrong. She had opened the case back. She had looked into the movement. And she had read Worthless, where the truth all along in plain sight available to anyone who actually bothered to look closely had been rare. And there is one more matter, Eleanor said and reached for a fourth folder, the one with the recordings in it and the medicated signatures and the careful timeline that 19 years of a nurse named Gloria's instinct had set in motion. But that one isn't a financial matter. That one we'll be discussing separately, with other people present. Joshua, who had said nothing this entire time, looked up at his wife then, and Barbara wrote that her son told her afterward that it was in that exact moment, not when he watched the footage, not in the dark of the parking lot, but right there in Eleanor's office, watching Hannah's face as she finally understood the size of what she'd misjudged, that he knew with a calm and terrible certainty that his marriage was over. The fourth folder was the one that ended things. A financial matter can be argued. A debt can be negotiated. A lien contested, a number disputed by lawyers across a table for months. But the fourth folder was not a number. It was footage and a nurse's signed statement and a timeline and a set of documents that a heavily medicated woman had been guided into signing, and there is no spin in the world polished enough to turn that into anything other than what it was. Eleanor handled it the way Barbara asked her to, not as vengeance, but as process. She filed a report of elder abuse with the proper authorities because it was abuse, and it deserved to be on a record somewhere in writing where it could not be smiled away. The power of attorney documents Hannah had extracted were declared void. A signature obtained from a sedated patient is worth exactly nothing, and Eleanor made certain it would stay worth nothing. There was no dramatic arrest, no courtroom, no satisfying clang of a cell door. Real life rarely offers those, and Barbara had never wanted them. What there was instead was something quieter and more permanent, a record. Hannah's name attached in an official file to what she had done in a way that would follow her. The fact of it made undeniable. And there was the marriage. Joshua did not rage. That was not in him, and what he felt had moved past rage in any case into something colder and more final. He simply could not unsee it. He had watched his wife day after day on that footage lean over his sedated mother and pour poison into her ear, move her water out of reach, guide her hand across a signature line. And a man can forgive a great deal, but he cannot go on sleeping beside the person he watched do that. He filed for divorce within the month. I want to be honest about this the way Barbara was honest about it, because she did not pretend it was a clean or happy thing. The marriage ending was not a triumph. There were 2 children in that house. Dylan was 7 and Mia was 4, and they did not understand why their mother had moved into an apartment across town, or why their father's face had gone gray and careful, or why Grandma had a new house they'd never seen. A family came apart, and children always pay part of the cost of that, no matter how necessary the coming apart is. Barbara knew it. She grieved it. Winning, she wrote, did not feel the way she'd once imagined it might, back when it was only a fantasy she rehearsed in the dark. It felt like the necessary, sorrowful dismantling of something that should never have been allowed to break in the first place. The call that undid her, the call she said she would remember on her deathbed, came from Dylan. It was about 10 days after she'd moved into the bungalow. She was in the back workshop, the one that faced the woodworking bench she was slowly turning into something of her own, when her phone rang with Joshua's number, and a small, whistling 7-year-old voice came through that was not Joshua's. "Grandma, it's me. Dad said you have a new house, with a workshop. Is that true?" "It's true, sweetheart," Barbara said and had to sit down. "Can I come see it? Mia keeps asking where you went. She cried at bedtime because she said you left and didn't say goodbye to her, and I told her you probably had to go somewhere quick, but I didn't really know why." A pause, and then in the too-old voice of a child who has been listening at the edges of adult rooms. "Grandma, did something bad happen? Everybody's sad and nobody will say why? Did somebody do something wrong?" Barbara closed her eyes. 7 years old, and already he could read a room. Richard, she thought, would have loved this boy past all sense. "Dylan," she said carefully, "listen to me. You didn't do anything wrong. Not one single thing. Neither did Mia. Whatever the grown-ups are sad about, it is not about you two. Do you understand me? Not at all. Is it about Mom? She did not lie to him, but she did not put a knife in his hand to carry either. Grown-ups make mistakes sometimes," she said. "Big ones. And then they have to spend a long time figuring out how to deal with them. That's what your mom and dad are doing right now. It's hard, and it's sad, and it's theirs to sort out. Not yours." "Are you still my grandma?" he asked. "Even with the new house?" And that small, frightened question was the thing that finally cracked her open after everything she had borne without cracking. After the room and the camera and the documents and the cold precision of her own revenge, that was what put tears on Barbara Moore's face. "I will be your grandma every single day for the rest of my life," she said. "That is not a thing that can change. Do you hear me? Not ever. Can I come see the workshop? Can you teach me the names again? Mainspring and the heartbeat one and the clever one." "Saturday," she said, wiping her face. "You and Mia, I'll make pancakes, and then I'll teach you every name there is." She could hear him relay this in a loud whisper to someone in the room with him, to Mia almost certainly, and she heard a small squeal of joy come through the phone from across some other room in some other house, and Barbara sat in her new workshop and held the phone, and understood that the most important things had not in the end been broken, only freed. She gave herself to the slow work of building a life. The Saturday pancakes became the fixed point of her week, steady as the swing of a balance wheel. Dylan came and learned the names of every part on the bench, laying them out on a green felt pad in careful rows. Mia came and demanded plain pancakes with extra syrup, and changed her definition of extra every single week, and insisted on sitting where she could see out the back window. Joshua came to more and more a quieter man now, sadder and somehow more present at the same time, as though losing the thing he'd been protecting by avoidance had finally taught him to stop avoiding. He coached Dylan's weekend soccer. He learned to braid Mia's hair badly, then less badly. He and his mother sat on her sunroom steps in the evenings and didn't always need to talk. Barbara set up her bench. She took in a few pieces again by referral, only for the pleasure of it bringing stopped things back to life. She joined a Saturday morning swim class and a book group at the local library, and she let herself slowly and without announcement be known by name again to people who would say it. Her treatment finished. The radiation ended, the daily pill became simply part of the architecture of her mornings, and Dr. Mehta, at her 6-month follow-up, told her she was doing very well, and meant it. The sick old woman they had wanted gone was, it turned out, not going anywhere. And Hannah, Barbara did not forgive her. I want to be clear about that, because this is the part where stories like this one usually reach for an easy golden reconciliation, and Barbara refused it. She did not stage a tearful gathering and hand out grace like party favors. What Hannah had done in that room was not the kind of thing you smooth over with a good cry and a fresh start, and Barbara, who had spent her whole life refusing to call brass gold just because someone wanted it to be, would not now call cruelty a misunderstanding. But she did leave one thing, one small thing, not a reconciliation, a door closed, but unlocked. She told Eleanor that if over years, not weeks over real, demonstrated unglamorous years with no audience and nothing to gain, and no $8 million dangled as a reward, if Hannah ever became a genuinely different person, a person who did the work for no reason but the work itself, then Barbara would at that point be willing to hear about it. Maybe, to let Hannah be someday at the edges of the grandchildren's lives if the grandchildren wanted it, and if she had earned it. Not because Hannah deserved it, because Barbara wrote grace that costs nothing isn't grace. It's just a way of avoiding the truth. Real grace is precise. You extend it exactly where it can take root and nowhere else, and you make people earn the soil. She did not know whether Hannah ever would. She rather doubted it. But she left the door unlocked anyway, because she had decided long ago what kind of person she was going to be, regardless of who anyone else turned out to be. She wrote that she thought Richard would have understood that. He always had been the more forgiving of the two of them. He used to say that grace wasn't weakness. It was just precision applied to mercy. And here I have to step back into the story myself, because I owe you the truth about how it reached me. I told you at the start that this story was about a 68-year-old woman who asked to remain anonymous, and that I'd call her Barbara Moore. Every word of that is true. What I didn't tell you was who actually sat down and wrote it all out for me, because it wasn't Barbara. But it was not the whole truth, and Barbara, the real woman behind that name, asked me when I agreed to tell her story to save one thing for the very end. Because she said the order of a revelation is the whole art of it, and I've come to think she was right about that, as she seems to have been right about most things. The letter did not come to me from Barbara. It came from her son. Joshua wrote to this channel 2 years after everything you've just heard. Barbara is 68 now. She was 66 when it happened, the man who gave in, who kept the peace, who absorbed everything so he'd never have to face it until the day a small camera he'd placed out of love forced him to face all of it at once. He wrote it as a kind of confession, and a kind of record, and a kind of apology to a mother, who he said had forgiven him far more easily than he would ever be able to forgive himself. He wrote it, he said, because he'd spent his whole life not looking, and he didn't want the one time he finally did look to disappear unspoken, as though it had never happened. He wrote down every part of it, even the parts that made him look like exactly what he'd been, a good man who wasn't quite good enough until he had no choice but to become better. He asked me to change the names, and I have. He asked me to protect his children, and I will. And he asked me to read one last line at the end in his mother's words, because he said it was the truest thing she ever told him, and the thing he most wanted strangers to carry away from a story about his family. She told it to him on the steps of her sunroom one evening the summer after all of it, while the kids argued happily over a movie inside, and the light went long and gold across the grass. He'd asked her finally quietly how she had stayed so calm through all of it, how she hadn't broken. And Barbara Moore, 66 years old, cancer behind her, $8 million beneath her, a steady and well-made life rebuilt around her, picked up Richard's old pocket watch from the table between them, and wound it 12 careful turns, and held it to her son's ear so he could hear the small, steady heartbeat, still keeping perfect time after 70 years. "They thought I was a machine that had finally stopped," she said. "Something worn out. Something you could write off and set aside and not bother to look inside of." She closed the lid. "But you don't tell what a thing is worth by the outside of it, Joshua. You never could. You have to open it up and look at how it's built and see what it does when it thinks no one is watching." She set the watch back down between them, still ticking. It was still running the whole time, she said. It just wasn't running for them anymore. And that My Friends is the story exactly as it was given to me. Thank you for listening. Wind your watches. And the next time the world is sure it has you all figured out, let it be sure. Then show it what you're made of underneath. I'll see you in the next one.